In this very in-depth forecast, the Central Plains are currently being monitored for severe weather as widespread to scattered storms are expected to bring widespread and potentially violent wind gusts greater than 70 miles per hour. A couple of tornadoes are possible, and scattered massive hail greater than 2 inches. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for May 23rd of 2024. For today, we do have an enhanced risk for Nebraska into northern Kansas with a pretty broad slight risk that extends across the entirety of the Central Plains, excluding southern Texas there and northern North Dakota, but we have a slight risk that extends across northern Texas into southern Arkansas, northern Louisiana, central Oklahoma, the majority of Kansas into northwestern Missouri, western Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, and southern North Dakota into portions of Minnesota, with a marginal risk that also extends across the eastern half of the United States, extending across Kentucky, Tennessee, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, northwestern South Carolina, almost the entirety of North Carolina, West Virginia, Maryland, southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, the New York metro region, New York City metro region, as well as Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, and Maine. So we have a very, very large area where we are expected to see the possibility of severe thunderstorms, with the Central Plains being the main location where we are expected to see severe thunderstorms. Risks for today do include a pretty broad 5% tornado risk that extends across Nebraska, western Iowa, Missouri, all the way into northern Texas there, where we could see the potential for a couple of tornadoes. A 30% damaging wind risk with the possibility of significant damaging wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour and potentially even greater across the northern Central Plains there for Nebraska. We will get more into this later in this forecast, but we also do have a 5% damaging wind risk that extends across the rest of the marginal threat for the eastern half of the United States. For our hail risk, we do have a pretty large 15% with a hashed area where we are expected to see the potential for some massive hailstones greater than 2 inches, but it will be bound to this 15% where we are expected to see the potential for some scattered large hail, and 5% hail risk where we could see some isolated large hail across the rest of the marginal risk for the eastern half of the United States. For tomorrow, we do have a pretty large slight risk that extends from northeastern Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, western Tennessee, northwestern Mississippi, western Kentucky, Indiana, southwestern Michigan, southern Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, with a marginal risk extending across the Ohio River Valley and the southeast. Risks for tomorrow do include a pretty large 2% tornado risk where we could see the potential for an isolated tornado, a 15% damaging wind risk where we are expected to see the potential for some scattered damaging wind gusts, and a 15% hail risk where we could see the potential for some scattered large hail, with the possibility of some massive hailstones greater than 2 inches for the southern extent of that risk for southeastern Oklahoma, northeastern Texas, and southwestern Arkansas. For day 3 outlook, we do have a enhanced risk for the Central Plains. We are monitoring this pretty closely because this could definitely have a pretty high ceiling for Kansas, Oklahoma, and northern Texas, with a probabilistic combined risk of a 30% with the possibility of some significant severe thunderstorms upcoming. And then for day 4, day 8 outlook, we currently have a 30%, which is equivalent of an enhanced risk for portions of the Ohio River Valley back into the Mississippi River Valley, for northeastern Arkansas, southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, western Kentucky, and western Tennessee to central Tennessee, where we are expected to see the possibility of some widespread severe thunderstorms that could definitely be significant upcoming. Taking a look at our excessive rainfall forecast, for today we do have a slight risk for western Tennessee, northern Mississippi, southern Arkansas, northeastern Texas, and northern Louisiana, where we could see the potential for some scattered flash flooding. We also do have a additional marginal risk that extends across the northern Central Plains into the Midwest and into some of the northern Rockies for North Dakota, portions of South Dakota, Nebraska, into northern Kansas, Iowa, northern Missouri, Minnesota, into southern southeastern Montana and northern Wyoming, where we could see the potential of some isolated flash flooding. For tomorrow, we do have a marginal risk for portions of the Ohio River Valley and back into the southern central plains and the northern Dixie states, for northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, South Carolina, western North Carolina, Virginia, southern West Virginia, Kentucky, southern Illinois, southeastern Missouri, Arkansas, northern Louisiana, southeastern Oklahoma, and northeastern and eastern Texas, where we could see the potential for some isolated flash flooding, as well as a additional marginal risk for the Midwest, for Michigan, northern Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where we also could see some isolated flash flooding. For our day 3 outlook, we do have a slight risk for portions of the Central Plains, for eastern Kansas, northeastern Oklahoma, northern Arkansas, and western Missouri, where we could see the potential for some upcoming scattered flash flooding. Taking a look at our 500 millibars and our surface observations and how those are going to work in conjunction for our risk for severe thunderstorms, starting off with our upper air pattern, and then we'll move to our surface observations. As of right now, we do have a trough that is currently back into the Rockies here. However, this is expected to move into the Central Plains into mainly the evening hours and the late afternoon hours of today. And this will support the risk for severe thunderstorms. This is expected to be a pretty powerful trough with a very broad 500 millibar jet here with very noticeable defluence aloft with 500 millibar flow that is expected to get upwards of 70 to 80 and potentially even a jet of upwards of 90 to 100 miles per hour that is expected to feed into the northern Central Plains. That will definitely support quite a lot of lift across the northern Central Plains specifically, but this comes as important for our risk for severe thunderstorms as we don't really have a whole lot of moisture that is expected to extend that far north, because just a couple days ago we had a cold front move through that cleared out a lot of moisture, and that led to a 50% tornado risk for the Midwest a couple of days ago. And the atmosphere has had very, very little time to recover and replenish that moisture into the northern Central Plains. So despite us having the lift for severe thunderstorms and the shear, that will definitely be supportive of some large hail, we don't really have that much moisture that will really support a whole lot of instability. Although our moisture is expected to continue to surge into the Central Plains, and it will have to surge quite quickly and surge with a lot of power to be able to support any kind of instability across this region, despite us having the lift. That leads to uncertainty with not only our quality of moisture, but how much moisture we are expected to have across the northern Central Plains. So that is expected to be my main uncertainty for the risk for severe thunderstorms for today. However, we do have the enhanced risk as the best area of overlap for our moisture and our forcing aloft, as we will have the majority of the trough at least move into this region and support lift and support the risk for severe thunderstorms. And this is also where the majority of our moisture is expected to extend up to. We should have moisture surge into this region by the afternoon hours, but again, uncertainty does still stand with that. As far as our surface observation goes, we do have a cold front that is currently moving across the Rockies here. This is expected to move into the Central Plains by the afternoon hours, and that will trigger our severe thunderstorms. We are also expected to see a dry line that's going to develop across the rest of the Central Plains. However, with more limited flow aloft, we won't really see a whole lot of forcing along that dry line, despite it being extremely sharp. We won't really have a whole lot of forcing along that dry line. However, storms could still fire along that dry line, and that's why the slight risk extends down across central and southern Kansas into Oklahoma, despite us not really having a whole lot of lift and a very weak flow aloft to really support much of a risk for severe thunderstorms. But storms are still possible along that dry line, and we already do have a little bit of storms ongoing, a couple of scattered storms for Texas into Arkansas and northern Louisiana, and that's why this slight risk is for down here, and that is mainly working with a subtropical jet to keep those storms going. So we do have a slight risk for that, but we could see storms fire along the dry line, but it really all depends. Taking a look at our 850 millibar winds and our low-level jet and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region. Again, we do have a 5% tornado risk for the majority of the Central Plains here. We are expected to see a really powerful low-level jet that is going to be ahead of our line with 850 millibar flows that is expected to get upwards of 70 miles per hour and potentially even approaching the mid to upper 70 miles per hour. Definitely a extremely powerful low-level jet that will support a insane amount of directional shear across this region and will definitely be pretty supportive of the potential for tornadoes across this region. Again, we will have to look at our instability, and again, that will be an uncertainty with the moisture that is expected to return in our moisture uncertainty. However, if we can get instability to return fast enough and for our instability to be pretty strong with how strong this low-level jet is, if we can get strong instability, I definitely think that we could see the potential for a conditional strong tornado. I definitely think that the SPC may at least consider adding a 10% tornado risk for Nebraska into northern Kansas here, especially with the look of our STP here. I definitely think that's possible. However, it would definitely be conditional risk. It would definitely not go up to a 15% tornado risk because it is definitely pretty conditional because it really all depends on how much moisture we are expected to see and how quickly it is expected to return to this region. But I definitely think a conditional 10% may be possible. I think the SPC may at least consider it. Taking a look at our 200 millibars and how that's going to affect our overall risk for severe thunderstorms with our spreading of our wind vectors, as well as our risk for hail across this region with our speed shear. Let's start off with our spreading of our wind vectors and the defluence that may be possible. There is definitely some subtle but definitely pretty noticeable spreading of our wind vectors across southern Nebraska into northern Kansas and central Kansas. That could definitely support a little bit of a void in the upper levels of the atmosphere. That could definitely support some pretty widespread lift, some pretty strong lift. However, it is a little bit more on the subtle side of things, but will definitely be an aiding factor in our risk for severe thunderstorms. We don't really see that extend down into Oklahoma or into Texas, but definitely pretty noticeable for Nebraska and northern Kansas there. But we definitely have some pretty widespread, strong 200 millibar flow aloft, with 200 millibar flow that is expected to get upwards of 100 knots across Kansas, upwards of 90 to 80 knots across southern Nebraska. Across Oklahoma, it could range anywhere from 100 knots to 90 knots, and down into Texas could range anywhere from 100 knots to 80 knots. Definitely some pretty widespread, some pretty strong flow will definitely be supportive of some pretty strong speed shear and the potential for some large hail, potentially some massive hail across this region that could definitely be greater than 2 inches. However, this will also support our risk for severe thunderstorms, definitely support quite a lot of lift. However, when it comes down to our dry line, we won't really have a whole lot of forcing at our surface, our low levels, or our mid levels. We don't really have a whole lot of flow outside of 200 millibars, which will probably not really support too much forcing along our dry line. But if we can get storms to fire along our dry line, we will definitely see the potential for some isolated storms with how the 200 millibar flow is oriented to our dry line. Will definitely support a little bit more of a discrete setup if storms can fire. Taking a look at our storm relative velocity and how that's going to affect our tornado risk across the Central Plains, we are expected to see quite a lot of storm relative velocity across this region. Storm relative velocity values that are expected to get upwards of 500 to even approaching 600 in some regions across the Central Plains. Definitely an extremely powerful low-level jet with upwards of the mid 500 meters squared a second squared of storm relative velocity ahead of our storms in Nebraska. Definitely quite a lot of storm relative velocity, and depending on instability, how strong our instability wants to get, definitely think a significant tornado could definitely be possible, but it would be conditional. Taking a look at our bulk shear and how that's going to affect our risk for hail across the Central Plains, we are expected to see some pretty strong bulk shear values that are expected to back our cold front that's going to move into this region and take over our dry line, with bulk shear values that are expected to get upwards of 50 to 60 to 40 knots across this region. That is going to be backing our dry line, our cold front. Any storms that can fire along our cold front will definitely be capable of the possibility of some scattered large hail, and that could definitely be significant, greater than 2 inches, as we definitely have some pretty big bulk shear values. Again, definitely supportive of some pretty large hail, and that will back our cold front all the way down to the southern Central Plains in Texas as well. Taking a look at our composite reflectivity so we can go over some general radar analysis. Probably not going to go over some timing. Starting off with our radar analysis, then the risk for the enhanced risk is expected to be a little bit more of a linear mode here. We are expected to see storms develop into more of an MCS-like feature across Nebraska and progress southeastward. This will overall be significantly more favorable for the risk of significant damaging wind gusts, where we could definitely see the potential for some widespread significant damaging wind gusts along this line. And definitely a very, very clear Boeing segment here. Again, definitely very favorable to overall more of a risk for some strong damaging wind gusts. We do have the additional risk for a couple of tornadoes that could definitely be embedded along this line. However, damaging wind gusts will definitely be the primary risk, and we could also see some hail embedded with this line as well. Further down to the south, we could not even see storms fire at all. Again, we don't really have a whole lot of forcing in our mid levels and our low levels along the dry line. We don't really have a whole lot of forcing along that dry line, so there's not really a whole lot of confidence that storms are going to fire along that dry line. So that's why it's only a slight risk extending down into Kansas, despite that dry line being there. Again, we could definitely see storms fire along that dry line. That's definitely a possibility, and they would definitely be more isolated with how it looks along our with our 200 millibar flow. Definitely a perpendicular orientation to that dry line, and with the lack of confidence and an overall lack of forcing along the dry line, we won't really see too many storms that would force it into more of an MCS like feature or more of a messy linear mode. It would definitely stay more of a discrete mode across Kansas if storms do fire. And then we already have some storms ongoing for the slight risk in the south. Definitely a couple of scattered to isolated storms anywhere from Arkansas, northern Louisiana, in Texas that are capable of 1 or 2 brief tornadoes, potentially a couple of tornadoes, some large hail, mainly into Texas, and the potential for some scattered damaging wind gusts. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability, this is where the uncertainty comes into play, because we are forecasted to have some impressive moisture return, with dew points that are forecasted to go from the low 50s, upper 40s in the enhanced risk region, all the way up to the upper 60s and the low 70s ahead of our line of storms across Nebraska by the very early morning hours of tomorrow. This is why I'm pretty skeptical, because this is impressive moisture return, and anything can happen with our moisture return. Our models have been in somewhat agreement. Definitely, all of them have been definitely indicating some pretty impressive moisture return. But our warm front is all the way down here, indicating where our moisture currently is, and it will have to make a marathon to be able to supply moisture up to the enhanced risk region. So I definitely think higher probabilities for the risk for severe thunderstorms overall could be possible. However, it is definitely pretty conditional with the uncertainty as far as our moisture return goes. But if we can get moisture return to this extent, we will definitely see some pretty strong instability values that will definitely be able to fuel our risk for severe thunderstorms. However, as far as our dry line goes, it's not really looking too good. There has been significantly more uncertainty along our dry line than for our enhanced risk along the cold front, with this HRRR model run that is indicating a massive hole in moisture right along our dry line, which will significantly limit the forcing along the dry line and isn't leading to storms firing along the dry line on this model run. And if that is the case, then we could see no storms at all fire along the dry line, especially with a lack of forcing in the upper levels of our atmosphere. If this is the case, we could see no storms at all. That is definitely a probability, but if we have some impressive moisture return and we can get a thicker dry line with some more impressive moisture than this, then storms could definitely fire along the dry line. But again, it is extremely uncertain. Taking a look at our temperature and how that's going to affect our instability, we are expected to see it get pretty warm across the central plains, with temperatures across the central plains that are expected to range anywhere from the low 80s, the mid 80s, the upper 70s, and potentially even reaching the 90s in Oklahoma and northern Texas, with the exception of some regions where rain-cooled air is already cooling down some areas in Texas into northern Louisiana and Arkansas. Again, that is an ongoing risk, so this slight risk here has already been ongoing. However, the majority of our risk does look like it is expected to be more of a nocturnal event, with some scattered severe thunderstorms that could fire along the dry line, where moisture is definitely a little bit more uncertain or more certain across Oklahoma. As you can see, a pool of rain cooled air there across Oklahoma. It's a pretty warm temperatures during the day that could definitely be surface-based and could harbor the potential for our various hazards, including the potential of some scattered damaging wind gusts, the potential for a couple tornadoes, and the potential for some scattered large hail. Maybe not for Kansas. It is definitely more uncertain the further north you go. For the enhanced risk region, this is going to be more of a nocturnal event. Storm is moving into the enhanced risk region around 10 to 9 p.m. after the sun has already set across this region, with temperatures that are expected to get upwards of the mid 60s, the upper 60s, and potentially even the 70s into southeastern Nebraska and northern Kansas, with some lower temperatures, and this being a little bit more of a nocturnal event where we could see less surface-based instability, less instability overall. That on top of the uncertainty with our moisture return, again, it is definitely getting more and more conditional the further that we look at these models. So with uncertain moisture, that could definitely be pretty strong, depending on how strong our moisture return is. We could definitely still see some pretty decently strong instability across this region, but it again really all depends. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability, we are expected to see some pretty strong lapse rates across the enhanced risk region, which will definitely be needed if we want to see strong instability, especially with the uncertainty with moisture and some lower temperatures, with it being more of a nocturnal event, with lapse rates that are expected to get upwards of the mid and upper 8s and even the low 9s ahead of our line. That will definitely support quite a lot of instability across the enhanced risk region, again, depending on our moisture return and depending on our temperatures, which will definitely be a little bit more on the lower side with it being more of a nocturnal event. Those lapse rates, again, will definitely support quite a lot of instability, but it, again, does heavily depend on our moisture return. This will also aid in our hail risk as well, as this will lead to a expanded layer for hail development aloft, and a strong updraft will be able to suspend rain and hail particles in that layer for hail development for longer and be able to support some larger hail sizes, especially with the bulk shear values that we have already seen being sufficient for some large hail. These strong lapse rate values will continue to remain across the rest of the central plains, and depending on moisture return, could definitely aid in quite a lot of instability across the rest of the central plains. Taking a look at our 700 millibar temperatures and our convective inhibition and how that's going to affect our instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. As of right now, we do have a pretty decently thick cap that is building across the central plains, with some pretty strong warm air advection to go with it at our 700 millibars. We will definitely see a pretty thick elevated mix layer across the central plains that will need to break if storms want to fire. That on top of uncertain moisture is definitely not a really good look for Kansas right now, especially up into Nebraska as well, where this is expected to be a little bit more of a nocturnal event, and with uncertain moisture, weaker surface-based instability could allow that cap to be in place for longer. And by the look of this model, with our storms ongoing and moving into an area of some really strong convective inhibition, that will definitely be a significantly limiting factor to our storms that are going to be across Kansas or across Nebraska, and definitely be pretty limiting. That is definitely another uncertainty on top of moisture. I do want to talk about moisture a little bit more. I do know that models have been in somewhat agreement about the fact that moisture is expected to be pretty impressive. Moisture return has been forecast to be pretty impressive. However, I am skeptical. I definitely think that Nebraska definitely has the potential for a conditional strong tornado now, with much more uncertainty as we continue to go through this forecast than previously anticipated. Again, a strong tornado would be definitely heavily conditional, especially with strong warmer advection out of the south and a pretty thick cap that is going to be limiting our storms that are going to be moving through Nebraska. Uncertain moisture that could either be extremely impressive or absolutely terrible, leading to weaker instability if it is terrible. Plus, with this being a more nocturnal event, we are expected to see weaker instability at the surface and less surface heating. That will be significantly more limiting to our potential for a tornado. I definitely think that the SPC did do a pretty decently good job putting a 5% tornado risk on this. They haven't pulled the gun on a 10% tornado risk just yet. That may be possible in a future outlook. I definitely think a significant tornado, conditional significant tornado, is definitely possible with some uncertainty, definitely quite a lot of uncertainty by this point. However, tornadoes are definitely still possible, but again, there is more and more uncertainty the further we go through this forecast. Taking a look at our instability. Before I go on with instability, again, we are looking at our most unstable cape, so it will be different from our surface-based cape. And doesn't truly show the potential for surface-based storms. It just shows the instability overall at our most unstable level, and how that's going to fuel our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. But what I want to say is, what you're about to see is if moisture return goes as planned for the enhanced risk region. If moisture return is pretty strong, we could definitely get some pretty strong instability. However, our instability is going to go from basically nothing to potentially upwards of 4,000 joules per kilogram across the southeastern Nebraska region in the enhanced risk region. That will definitely be more than sufficient in fueling our severe thunderstorms, including fueling the potential for a possible significant tornado, as well as the possibility for some strong damaging wind gusts that could definitely be upwards of 70 miles per hour or greater, as well as the potential for some scattered large hail embedded in this line. But again, this is if moisture return goes as planned. We could have anywhere from terrible instability to really strong instability. Again, it really all depends with our moisture return, and I am pretty skeptical about it. But this is if moisture return goes as planned. We could definitely see some pretty strong instability that will be more than sufficient in fueling our various risks and the possibility for some significant severe thunderstorms across that region. Across the rest of the Central Plains in Kansas, we are expected to see a little bit more of a moisture hole across this region, more uncertain moisture that could lead to some weaker instability in some more widespread regions, especially along the dry line. We don't really have a whole lot of instability along that dry line, so not really a whole lot of confidence in this model run, at least, of the dry line firing. But we could definitely see some pretty strong instability overall if moisture return goes as planned across the Central Plains. That will be sufficient in fueling our risk for severe thunderstorms and our various hazards. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms overall. Across the enhanced risk region, we are expected to see significantly less surface-based cape compared to our most unstable level, with surface-based cape that could potentially reach upwards of the mid-3000s and potentially greater. However, that will likely be as a result of a lot of surface-based convective inhibition across this region, the lack of confidence in moisture return, and the lack of quality of that moisture. Plus, with this being more of a nocturnal event, we won't have that surface heating, which will lead to significantly less surface-based CAPE. So we have a multitude of reasons why this risk for severe thunderstorms could fail. But if moisture return again goes as planned, we could definitely see a decently sized risk for severe thunderstorms across the enhanced risk region. So I definitely wouldn't let your guard down just yet, because I could be absolutely wrong. Moisture return could be absolutely insane and be more than sufficient in fueling our severe thunderstorms, but I am definitely pretty skeptical about our instability and our moisture return for today. But across the rest of the Central Plains, again, definitely less surface-based instability compared to our most unstable level. However, will still be sufficient in fueling surface-based storms and the potential for tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability, the majority of the Central Plains does look like it is expected to have a pretty decently sized buildup of some moderately strong 0 to 3 kilometer instability. That could definitely aid with any storms that may develop across Kansas into Oklahoma. As far as Nebraska, we aren't really expected to see a whole lot of 0 to 3 kilometer instability. That's even with strong moisture return in this model run. So regardless, we shouldn't really see a whole lot of 0 to 3 kilometer instability across this region. That will likely not really be too much of an aid for our risk for severe thunderstorms across the enhanced risk region. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that's going to indicate the risk for tornadoes across this region, we have some really high energy helicity index values across the Central Plains that are very, very indicative of the potential for a couple of tornadoes. If the confidence was higher for tornadoes, which it honestly really isn't right now, it is definitely extremely conditional. We could definitely see higher probabilities for our tornado risk. However, because of that conditionality, it is definitely probably not really on the table for higher tornado probabilities, but it is heavily indicating a very strong overlap of our ingredients for tornadoes. Again, energy helicity index is the raw combination of storm relative helicity and instability. This is indicating both of those ingredients coming together really, really well to support the potential for tornadoes across the Central Plains. And as storms develop across the enhanced risk region, we have some really high energy helicity index values that would be more indicative of a 15% tornado risk. However, with that extreme conditionality that we do have today, that tornado probability will not be met, with energy helicity index values upwards of 12, 11, and even 13 in some regions, heavily indicating that the ingredients are in place for the potential of tornadoes across this region. Again, that's why I say that I do think a conditional strong tornado is possible, but it really, really all depends. The ingredients for a strong tornado could definitely come together. It's definitely possible, but again, it is definitely heavily conditional. Taking a look at our wind gust models and how that's going to indicate the potential for damaging wind gusts across the 30% risk for damaging wind gusts. Again, with this more linear mode, that will definitely be a little bit more favorable for the potential of some strong damaging wind gusts embedded in this line. And we are expected to see some pretty widespread damaging wind gusts along this line, with some areas that could potentially reach upwards of 60 to even 70 miles per hour and potentially even greater in some regions. However, the majority of damaging wind gusts will probably be more so limited to around 40 to 50 and even 60 miles per hour, with the exception of some regions that could potentially reach upwards of 60 or 70 to 80 miles per hour across this region. It is definitely not expected to get upwards of derecho strength, but we could definitely see some pretty strong damaging wind gusts in some areas. Taking a look at our mesoanalysis page for our hail models and how that's going to indicate the potential for large hail. As of right now, we do have upwards of 16, 20, and 24 across Oklahoma. That is working its way northward very slowly into Kansas. It's actually much more northward than actually I would have thought. I thought it would be more so limited to northern and central Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle as of right now. However, it is slowly working its way northward, indicating that risk for hail is going to continue to push its way northward. For significant hail, we do have upwards of 3 to 4 to 5 in southern Oklahoma into northern Texas there. And then for our SARS significant hail percentage, we do have upwards of a 90% for significant hail across Oklahoma. And again, this risk will continue to surge northward as that warm front slowly progresses northward, and those ingredients for large hail continue to push off to the north. So everything will continue to move northward very, very slowly. For our SARS hail size, we do have upwards of 4 across the Central Plains. That's going to continue to work its way northward. So already indicating a pretty decently sized risk for hail across this region. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong in this forecast or like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are JaxonWX, Weather Watcher, and One Nation Weather. The links to the channels will be in the description, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.